Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you to the Norwegian Atlantic Committee for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor among those speakers who have spoken before me. I also want to say special thanks to François Hesbourg because he said it is the time for the North to look to the South. And by my calculations, I am the southernmost speaker in this event today. I'm half Greek, half Cypriot, so definitely far away from here in European terms. I think it's also interesting to say, before I go into my few points, that always when I find myself speaking about the EU in sessions like this, there's an optimistic and a pessimistic thought that comes to me. On the one hand, I think, oh wow, European Union is on this panel with China, Russia, and the US. The European Union does not have a seat, a permanent seat at the Security Council, no seat actually. France has nuclear capabilities, but it's not, no one would say yet that it's, perhaps ever, that it's the EU that has it. And when we think of the EU's defense budget, if we put it all together and we assume it's around 200 billion euros, then depending what calculations one believes on China or not, it could be the second or the third in the world, but no one really thinks that way. So I always think, good for the EU that it's on this panel. And at the same time, I'm pessimistic in the sense that I know that in the audience, everyone is asking you to come in because, well, we're talking about great powers, so what is the EU going to do in this world? So it's not that the EU is the great power in the panel, it's just what is it going to do in this world of returning great powers? So what I want to do today, and we are in a university, so I hope you will allow me in my first few minutes to be a bit academic about what power means, and then I'll go into what the EU is doing in this world. But I think it's important to remember that we are today in a very difficult moment, geopolitically speaking. But this phrase, the return of great power rivalry, has been in countless documents in many sides of the Atlantic and in Asia and in South America, where I have some experience, for at least a decade, if not longer. So this great power rivalry return is not necessarily new. But I think what is new at the moment is the urgency with which all other actors are called upon to somehow find their place in this environment. And this, in many ways, has echoes of Cold War times. I don't believe we are in a new Cold War. I hope we are not. But I do think what is happening in reflections around the world is similar to that. I also think for the EU to get there slowly, a few crucial assumptions about its powermanship or powerwomanship are being posed at the moment. And here I want to become slightly academic for a second. For many of us who have been looking at EU foreign policy for, I would say, 20 years, the debate about the EU's power in the world has always been a very philosophical and existential one. Going back to the theories about the capability expectations gap, what was the EU anticipated to do by others and what could it actually deliver, normative power Europe, which would aim to promote norms and values and thus become powerful in the sense of exerting influence, civilian in its security and defense policy, and many others. That was the debate in the 2000s. And in many ways, it seems like today it's been replaced by the conversation about strategic autonomy, where at times it seems that it's been decided we don't talk so much about the nature of the power, but about the capacity to act. How does the EU act? But all of these conversations at times, I think, narrow down to the basic definitions of what foreign policy is, which is basically the ability to shape the environment in ways that are consistent with the interests and values of the specific actor. I mean, that's a very broad definition, but it is what many of us understand by it. So I've been asked to mention strategic autonomy, but for me, in many ways, this is an evolution of the power debate. And maybe the power debate never got a specific answer about the European Union because the European Union is a very different actor from every other actor that we are aware of. But what we know about power, what we've learned from the realists, but also from others that came after them, is that power has both material components, and these are coming back with a vengeance, natural resources, energy, militaries. We are there again, no doubt. But we've also learned that power has to do with influence and the ability to exert that And that doesn't always come in very quantifiable quantities. It comes with the ability to create alliances and structures in which dialogue and other dimensions of it will bring about consensus. And it comes with the ability to also create security communities. That's also sounding like something from the past, but I think it's important to remember those elements of what power is, and to think a bit about what great powers are today. Obviously, China and the United States, arguably Russia to a degree, although that can be called a regional power, I think, in some. In this war we have today, by the way, we are looking at it globally, but it's still a regional conflict, and hopefully it will stay one. So there are the elements I have mentioned, but there's also new elements in that. There's the element of technology, perhaps not new, because nuclear has also been the disruptive tech that defined great powermanship before, and now it's also on other fields of technology. And it's also the capacity, again, to influence, but this time in different ways, through disinformation, through manipulation of elections, through other issues. So I frame power like this because I want to get to the EU, and I want to get to what the EU is doing. I also think it's important to think about power this way, because those of us, and I'm sure there's many of us who are from the international relations discipline, know that unfortunately one great thesis about the tragedy of great powers has often been true, and that is that even when great powers are seeking security, they often end up engaging in major conflict. So let's hope the changing nature of power has changed that. For the EU, I would say the current situation, Russia's war on Ukraine, has challenged at least 5 fundamental assumptions about the way it would be a power. The first one was the assumption that military may not be the main source of power or of influence projection. I think at least other things plus military have definitely become something that we now know is true, needs to be a resource for power. The second is that interdependence would be a way out of conflict. And today, we see the weaponization of that interdependence with a boomerang effect on security. The third is that international law, and particularly arms control treaties that have been in place since the end of the Cold War, would create an environment where that interdependence, that economic interdependence, would be facilitated to work towards peace. And that has been challenged gradually through the erosion of these treaties, but also through the violation of international law. And the fourth is that among those authoritarian powers that were rising or re-emerging, they would, and someone else said it here before, these would be separate theaters of confrontation. And now we're seeing those creating what could potentially be blocs or alliances, and that, of course, is much harder to face. It's different to have a China strategy and a Russia strategy when Russia and China are not engaging, and very different to have one when they are really putting together the resources of power that they have to a degree. So these are the 4. But the 5th one, I think, is the most important, and it will lead to my next point, which is the EU and what it is doing. The 5th point for the EU, I think, is that the big assumption that has been challenged is that the EU can be thinking about what it wants to do in terms of power and in terms of actorness. Now, it's about doing. And I think even when one is in Brussels, and there's Stephen and others who are in Brussels, suddenly the discussion about what this or that means, what strategic autonomy means or strategic sovereignty means, is starting to be a bit less there, and everyone is talking about what to do, how to use the instruments and the tools that the EU has to project power. And in fact, that itself is in the Strategic Compass, which is the document that was recently presented and prepared by the 27 member states, and which aims to set the vision for the EU's course in terms of security, defense, but much more. And I think it's very interesting that that is where power is mentioned in the Strategic Compass, using the instruments and policies the EU has to project power. So it's not, strategic autonomy, by the way, is mentioned only one time in that document, which I think is interesting. But the idea is really how to do now, based on existing policies, based on existing instruments, and also to look forward. Now, what the EU can do now, what these instruments and policies are, come from a very traditional understanding in many ways of where the EU's power lies, and that is in the size of its economy, its trade power, and its policies, the supranationalized policies. And so there, the tools for the EU's power come from reactively building resilience, and there we see a number of initiatives and policies to do with resilient supply chains, bringing back, or rather, that's a very Trump term, I take it back, the resilience in terms of energy, but also countering coercion in many ways, economic and other. And proactively, of course, it has to do with projecting power by standard setting, the so-called Brussels effect, which we see in digital issues, climate issues, I would say, creating technological sovereignty to avoid and to escape coercion in that area, leveraging trade, again, against the coercion of other powers through instruments that are now all the hype in Brussels, like the anti-coercion instrument, countering foreign subsidies, foreign investment screening, and building alliances. And I think building alliances is something that has received enormous attention recently, because it's very clear that in this environment, on all these levels, on the technological level, on the trade level, and obviously in defense, alliances are the way to go. I would argue that NATO, the United States, Norway, Japan, Asian democracies, globally democracies are having the EU is really having a moment of thinking, reflecting on how to work with that. And we've heard today about the Trade and Technology Councils, most notably with the US, but now also being launched with India, a number of dialogues being launched. The idea of creating the structures through which coordination can work in the face of geopolitical crisis. And I think this is actually something that the EU is doing well. It's creating those structures and it's activating them when needed. And when one looks at the speed with which sanctions were decided in coordination with NATO, the EEA, G7, these structures are there. When one looks at how quick it was to decide with the United States on the export controls aspects of sanctioning Russia, these structures are there. So this is where the EU has power. We're talking about defense and security today, and I don't want to go into that in detail because it's going to be the issue of the next panel, as I understand. But I think where defense and security are concerned, it is important to look at the EU and what is happening today. As I mentioned, the strategic compass, which has been presented, is ambitious to propose actions and strategies to lead to the EU having a more concrete, robust, and expensive security and defense policy by 2030. Defense innovation is being boosted, and I think the financing of what is going in that will support whatever the EU is doing operationally, but also create that sense of an EU defense policy. Space and cyber are spaces in which we're seeing the EU come forward with a number of defense initiatives. But crucially also, I think the activation of the European Peace Facility, which is providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, financing the provision, including of lethal weapons to Ukraine, is really a landmark in what the EU is doing in security defense. It's a mentality-changing dimension of it. And I think we might see a lot coming out of that 2 billion and potentially more. And really, just to finish here, I said mentality, and I think mentality is really what is behind what the EU is doing in security and defense and whether that will move forward. It's the mentality and the way of thinking about the EU that may potentially make the EU support in this way more Ukraine, first of all, and then whatever else is needed in the context of this crisis, that it will make the EU be a credible partner also in security and defense for its partners like the United States, that will strengthen the European pillar within NATO that has been mentioned, that will, in the long run, provide EU member states with a reason to invest in having capabilities which will be used in the security of places as far away as the Indo-Pacific or Africa, which are not necessarily the core of interest of some of the EU member states. So it's really a mentality shift, and I think that is perhaps the most important thing that the EU needs to do, because let's not forget, anything that happens in the EU is a decision made among many, and for many to agree on something, it's usually the lowest common denominator that gets the vote. So to raise the lowest common denominator, there has to be a mentality that believes in that. So I will end in this. Thank you very much.